Billy could simply not believe it. He had traveled back to his hometown to visit a loved one's grave, but instead, he found something he had never expected. He had stumbled upon a gravestone with his old picture and his name on it. How was that possible? He was alive and well. Billy just could not understand how and why it got these. But soon enough, he would find out the shocking truth. Billy was left with a million questions, and there was only one way he could think of to figure out what was going on here. But this was something that he swore he would never do again. He hesitated for a long time, but he knew he needed answers. Billy took his mobile phone out of his pocket and dialed the number. It only rang a few times until the phone was picked up. You have a lot of explaining to do. But why was a headstone with Billy's name and photo on this graveyard? Who was responsible for this? And who did Billy call to get his answers? But before we start our story, smash the like button, make sure to subscribe and hit the notifications bell so you won't miss any new stories. There was a reason that Billy hadn't been home in over a decade. Ever since he was a child, he'd hated his hometown with a passion. Shortly after his 18th birthday, he'd left and never thought twice about returning. But recently, something happened that made Billy resolve to go back one last time. Billy had recently received the unexpected news that his father had passed away 3 years ago. He hadn't kept in touch with his family, but he never thought that he would hear about his father's death with so much of a delay. It was now time to face old demons and go home. Billy's family still lived in the city, but none of them were on speaking terms. When he was a child, his family had made his life hell. To protect himself, Billy stopped talking to all of them, even during holidays and other special occasions. Only 2 people in his family had ever bothered to reach out to him. Billy's parents had made some effort to stay in touch, but to him, it was already too late for that. He wasn't interested in maintaining those relationships anymore. He wanted to focus on a healthier future, with people who cared about him. But then, he found out about his father's death in the strangest of ways. Without realizing it, Billy had left his father listed as his emergency contact in some old files and documents. When Billy got into a car accident and had to be taken to the hospital, the facility called his father to notify him that Billy was being admitted for treatment. That's how they found out about the older man's passing. But how had he died? Even though Billy wasn't close with his parents, he'd still been surprised by the news. No one else in the family had ever told him about his father. Billy felt like he needed to find closure and close that chapter for good, and the best way to do that was to say goodbye. So he started planning a trip back home. He had no idea that it would change his life forever. Billy looked up the information in the newspaper and figured out where his father was buried. He planned to go to the grave, say his goodbyes, and head back home. Billy had moved across the country after moving away. To reach his hometown and his father's grave, he would have to drive for almost a full day. Billy's hometown was in a historic area of the country where there were many small graveyards. It was common for old families to have their own cemeteries. Thankfully, he'd been able to find out exactly where his father had been buried. When he arrived and started to look around, the location surprised him. Billy walked along the rows and searched through the names. Some of them sounded familiar. He wondered why he knew so many of the surnames when he'd been gone from town for over 10 years. And he paused to read the first names and dates as well. He couldn't believe what he saw. An icy chill crept over him. Billy realized that many of the graves belonged to people he used to know. There were more than a few of his former classmates buried here. The number of acquaintances and friends in the graveyard disturbed him. They should all have been around his age. Had there been some kind of accident? Billy was reaching the last few graves in the cemetery. He checked the sign again, wondering if he'd been mistaken somehow. But there was still half a row of headstones left to check. He continued to worry about whether he could trust the hospital until he reached the last set of headstones and saw his surname in the distance. When Billy read the engraving on the weathered stone directly in front of him, he jolted in shock. It wasn't his father's grave at all. Instead of his father's information, Billy was looking at his own picture, name, and date of birth. He read it multiple times, convinced that his own mind was playing a trick on him. But the numbers and letters remained the same. It was his grave. Billy looked around the cemetery and expected to hear someone start laughing any minute now. This had to be a sick joke. He imagined some old friend or relative planned this to torment him, as a way of punishing him for not staying in touch. Yet he couldn't help but wonder why they would wait all these years to have their laugh. When Billy calmed down enough to collect his thoughts, he realized that this was far too elaborate and expensive to be a prank. The headstone had obviously been there for a long time, and no one else was around to see him during his visit to the graveyard. There had to be a simple explanation. Billy stared at his headstone, contemplating how he was going to find out the truth about the situation. He needed answers and finally accepted that there was only one way to get them. Billy had planned on only being in town for a short trip, but he realized that he needed to stick around if he wanted to unravel this unusual mystery. Billy knew that he needed to stay, but he didn't feel like going to his parents' house just yet. He needed to clear his mind and get his thoughts straight before he faced his mother and the rest of his family. They hadn't even spoken in such a long time. He had no idea how she would react when she saw him. Then it dawned on him. What if nobody had contacted him for so long because they all thought he was dead? He noticed the flowers at his grave. Someone must have put those there recently. Suddenly, a feeling of sadness overcame him. He felt sorry for his mother. She had lost her husband, and she thought she lost her son too. He was still upset with her for the things that happened when he was little, but deep inside his heart, he knew that he needed to make things right. He decided to get in touch with her tomorrow. First, he needed a good night's sleep after such a bizarre day. He booked a night in the first motel he could find, ordered some pizza, and took a shower. As he was eating, he thought about the events of that day. He still couldn't believe what he had seen at the graveyard. How was it possible that so many people he knew were buried there? He remembered most of the names he saw. They were all people who he had been on good terms with when he still lived here. Some of them he would even call his friends. He hadn't talked to them in years, and now they were all gone. It didn't make any sense to Billy. He felt like he needed a good night's sleep to process everything that he had seen that day, but no matter what he tried, he just could not fall asleep. Whenever he closed his eyes, he was transported right back to the cemetery. The mystery of everything kept him awake for hours, and he knew he needed to solve it. It was clear that he was not going to fall asleep anyway, and he realized that there were better ways he could spend his time than just laying in bed, doing nothing. He had so many questions that he desperately wanted to find an answer to. He still did not understand how and why his own gravestone had ended up there. He also hadn't found his father's final resting place yet, and he could just not understand how all of his friends and acquaintances had ended up there as well. He felt like he was missing something, and he needed to solve the puzzle. While he was still in town, Billy needed to find out what had happened to all of them. The only plausible explanation was a terrible accident. But the longer he thought about it, the less sense it made. He hadn't followed local news, but surely such a tragedy would have made national headlines. Yet he couldn't recall hearing anything about it. He searched online, but no matter what he typed, he found nothing. No reports, no obituaries, nothing. Unease crept in. Had something else happened? Had it been covered up? The thought unsettled him. The sooner he found answers, the sooner he could leave. Regret weighed on him. He had lost touch with people he once cared about. Now, it was too late, or so he thought. A sudden vibration pulled him from his thoughts. His phone. A message. He expected his wife, but the sender was an unknown number. His face turned pale as he read, "Missed us? Come to the cemetery. We're waiting for you." His hand shook. This couldn't be real. Checking his phone again, the message remained. He knew what he had to do. He drove to the cemetery, fear gripping him. He didn't believe in ghosts, but who had sent that message? He hesitated in the car, dreading what lay ahead. Finally, he took a deep breath and stepped out. The darkness was oppressive, broken only by flickering candlelight on some graves. He wasn't fond of the dark, and this was much worse. Was this a trap? Had someone harmed his friends and now waited for him? He had to know. Suddenly, noises rustled nearby. At first, he dismissed them as an animal, but they grew louder, moving closer. Panic clawed at him. Every instinct screamed for him to run, but he forced himself to stay. Then, something caught his eye, a new gravestone. The night before, his had been the last in its row. Now, another stood beside it. When he saw the name, his heart stopped. It was his father's. This wasn't possible. He had checked the cemetery just the night before. Who had put it there? He turned, and beyond the gravestones, a shadow moved toward him. The darkness obscured its form, but it was approaching fast. This was beyond his capacity to handle. He had come for answers, but now faced something terrifying. Frozen with fear, he could barely breathe. The shadow loomed closer. His instincts finally kicked in, but his body refused to move. Instead, he closed his eyes and screamed. But nothing happened. No impact, no attack. Instead, he heard something unexpected: laughter. Opening his eyes, he saw his old friends, classmates, and acquaintances. They were all laughing hysterically. Among them stood his parents, his father, very much alive. Disbelief washed over him. What was happening? It had all been a prank, a way for his friends to get back at him for not keeping in touch. Even his wife had been in on it, hoping he would reconnect with them. At first, he was overwhelmed, but soon enough, he laughed along with them. That night changed everything. He made a genuine effort to restore the relationships he had neglected. Eventually, he even moved back to his hometown, making up for lost time with his friends and family.